Hey, look, I want to say thank you for having me on today. Just as an introduction, I'm Andrew Morrison. I'm the current chair of Beef and Lamb New Zealand. I'm actually a Southland sheep and beef farmer. Just to give our international guests a bit of a concept, I farm about 7,000 sheep and about 500 Angus beef cattle down in the southern parts of New Zealand, Otago and Southland. Last time I represented on the stage with Pablo was at a Future Whenua Summit down in Southland. And he then invited me to come on and do this presentation to you. Look, as I'm scoping what we're going to talk about today, look, we are in the midst of a global sustainability debate or a sustainability reset, which was 100% appropriate. In the New Zealand context, we had the economic reset of the 80s or the 1980s when we did some quite fundamental economic reform. And farmers were pretty much told, crack off and become business-like, and you will operate in a market-led, unsubsidised environment. Now, farmers listened to that, and they were really, really successful at that. And we've seen lots of land use change. We've seen diversification of farms into forestry operations, into dairy operations, into horticultural operations. You possibly won't find a country in the world that exhibits land use change like New Zealand. The challenge that's led to is, as we factored the market drivers, that we possibly weren't appropriately factoring all the environmental impacts of the decisions we were making. Now we've got to the point, and the appropriate point, where we have to factor that stuff in. So that's just giving a New Zealand context. But as I wanted to say, this is a global sustainability debate. And what we've got the challenge of is the likes of United Nations or individual governments are trying to figure out how they sustainably feed a growing world population. I suspect all you learned participants will know that 1928 was the year that the global population doubled from 1 billion to 2 billion. Since then, it took 33 years to put the next billion people on the planet, and then we've been trucking on 1 billion people about every 12 or 13 years since. So as we have this sustainability debate, we also have to factor how we're going to feed a growing population. To put some context around this, there's a bunch of land users sitting, or policymakers sitting on this call, and I, as a farmer and representing Beef and Lamb New Zealand, quite often you feel like your sector is taking disproportionate focus in a lot of these debates. Ruminant production is actually is a great way of feeding with nutrient-dense product a lot of our global population. What we have to do then is sort out the appropriate metrics around that so that we can all make the appropriate decisions. Look, I'm not ignoring, so I want to sort of state, obviously, ruminant production has an impact on the environment, but it's quite crucial we get the settings right so that as we're making the decisions around land use and appropriate impacts on the environment, we're having a very mature debate and understanding all the aspects of that. The global dynamics from my perspective is, I sort of chunk it into a few pieces here. First up, we've got some reasonably rudimentary global dynamics where we're trying to compare our production systems on reasonably rudimentary figures. We're using things like what's a kilo of meat produced in relation to its water consumption, or what's the appropriate GHG figure to use around the production of ruminant protein. Is it GWP 100? Is it GWP star? What is the impact and efficiencies? All these things will evolve over time and help us take us to a better place and around understanding their impact. But that's why I wanted to call out Pablo and the team today for having conversations and summits like this that we can understand and to work out where the next piece of work needs to be done to inform the conversation. I quickly just mentioned, one of the things we do is have to understand the nutritional composition of the comparative food production systems we're looking at. We have to look at the comparative impact on the environment of methane versus broadacre cropping and the life cycle analysis of alternative proteins or the likes. We have to understand the impacts of the global warming potentials, be it as at 100, as a GWP star, because it's the warming that impacts or is the target reduction as opposed to the just gas as just a number. Look, historically, you'll know when I referenced that there's been significant land use change in New Zealand. You know, our GHG profile from our sheep and beef livestock sector has effectively decreased from 40% by 40% since 1990. So look, it's quite staggering, the reduction or the land use change and how it influences what your current profile is. The other thing I'd like to say as we go through here, like there is initiatives like the regenerative agricultural conversation we're having. They are 100% appropriate conversations to be having. What we need to do is just get quite granular on this and understand the impacts as opposed to the perceived differences it's making. We at Beef and Lamb have worked pretty closely with Louis Shipper to understand soil carbons and their builds and their losses over time. So this is the stuff that we just need to keep working on. Fundamentally, you know, it comes down to us is, do we fundamentally buy into the sustainability debate? And the answer is yes. Do we want to leave our soils, water and climate in a better state than when we found it? Yes. So of course, that's, you know, the starting point for all of the initiatives that we support, either from Beef and Lamb or in conjunction with government. Just turning now for our global participants in this, turning to domestic front New Zealand. Look, it is a statement. New Zealand public and New Zealand government want to see improvements in the environment. The key areas I'll quickly talk through now, we talk about three circles. We talk about climate change circle, we talk about water quality circle, and we talk about the Indigenous biodiversity circle. Now that's a trap we've fallen into already, where we've constructed those pieces of legislation in isolation. So the first point I want to talk to, and it actually came out of Climate Change Commission's recommendation too, is when we're facing these problems, we actually need to take an integrated approach to solve these. On my farm in South Otago, when I'm looking at integrating my solutions, my first priority is my animal welfare. So I want shade, shelter, provision for watering. So I make those decisions. But if I can link those solutions for shade and shelter to recognition and creation of sequestrations, and if I can link those solutions to also the stock exclusion out of waterways, and water quality protection and recreation of wetlands and biodiversities, well, kind of all the solutions come together and the whole conversation that looks nowhere near as scary. That's the piece that I would come from our farming community, and that's what we're pushing. It's the integrated approach to improve biodiversity, water quality, and climate change at the same time. And that's why we at Beef and Lamb have developed the new farm plan, which is, you know, very aligned with what the minister's thinking, integrated farm plans, of integrating the solution for all the current challenges we're facing. So we are a big supporter of information, hence the reason we just released our GHG calculator tool, so that farmers, when they get their heads around what the potential solutions are, they buy into it far easier. Look, I'll skip through this because I'm probably going slightly over time. The next thing is I would encourage, as we're thinking about this, is always, we've been a big proponent of outcomes-based regulation. That's been one of the genesis of New Zealand's position to date, and I'd fully support that. As a government, tell us what you want us to achieve and lead us be creative and find the solutions, as opposed to being an input-based, prescriptive, rules-based methodology. Look, we've just had an instance out of New Zealand where we struggled a bit with the zero carbon bill, and the creation of the split gas debate, the creation of the Indigenous Maori government industry agreement on Hei-Waka-Kinoa was an outcomes-based approach to reach a solution. We then went to the essential fresh water, where we had some prescriptive inputs like, you will sow your crop by a certain date, you will not crop on this type of soils, etc. Well, in the southern regions where I live, that was impossible. You know, if it was snowing or raining on any given day, my main priority was protect my soils and not to put heavy machinery and not to risk my my health and safety by putting people up on hills or in tractors on inappropriate, conditions. So look, we all want the same outcomes, but I would just encourage that as we're thinking about policy, use them as tell me what you want to achieve and give the farming community the ability to hold their feet to the fire and come up with creative ways to do that. The other thing I'll quickly skip over is, look, humans are great at finding solutions. When you give them the challenge that you put in front of them, let them come up with their solution. And the other real powerhouse is when you come up with a solution, let a collective come up with a solution. So I wanted to call out the catchment community initiatives that we've got in New Zealand. As we're facing what started out as a water quality challenge, now links to the Indigenous biodiversity and the climate change. You put a bunch of a community in a room and say, look, I need you guys to sort this out, or we've got to, because this is your community, this is your water, this is your tracts of native biodiversity. How are you going to hold yourselves to account to do that? So look, there's 100 catchment communities that have sprung up across New Zealand. These are invaluable because it's not only farmers in those catchment communities, you bring in your participants in your rural towns, your small rural communities, and you just get buy-in, and it's just excellent because it takes the blame game out of there and turns it to a very, okay, what are we going to do about this, fellas? What are our solutions going to look like? Okay, look, the other thing that, as I say, it's about getting, and I'll finish up on this point, it's about getting the policy settings right. So this goes back to that inputs versus outputs. I'll use the example of Indigenous biodiversity. If you can then set your policy that you drive the right behaviours and turn something into an asset rather than a liability, you will get people trucking off down the solution-based path pretty quickly. We went through a process where we were going to treat Indigenous biodiversity like all our previous generations had not valued that, and we were going to have to call them significant natural areas and fence them off and impose costs. I saw a comment from Lynn there in the chat room. Just for your guys' context, I'm the 5th generation in my farming family since my ancestors took it up in 1875, and we really value that land. And a lot of New Zealand farmers value the land. That's why Beef and Lamb did a piece called the Norton Report. There's 2.8 million hectares of native biodiversity sitting on the sheep and beef estate. So that would demonstrate that that farming community has loved that native biodiversity over the years and has protected it. So government then turns that into an imposition or a liability. Of course, guys are going to wind up about that. If we flick that debate and we say, well, actually, we would like to recognise you for your ecosystem services, your creation of native biodiversity tracts of land, biodiversity corridors, appropriate sequestrations, everyone goes, oh, great. I'm not worried about having one of those now. Now I want 2 or 3 of those. So it's like a simple live example of get the policy settings right, you'll drive the right behaviours. I want to call out the government finally for working with industry in the zero carbon bill creation, using the appropriate, first country in the world to recognise the split gas debate and the warming impact of the gases as opposed to just the figures associated with gas reductions, linking the appropriate methane settings to the most up-to-date science. Also want to call them out for the Hei-Waka-Ekinoa construction where, we had a really mature conversation with their government, and I really want to thank them, giving industry, Maori and government the premise that, yep, you guys have got a challenge. What is your impact on the climate change debate? We need a system to build so that on farm we know your individual impact, and we will build a system, Hei-Waka-Ekinoa. We will know your on-farm emissions. We will know your on-farm mitigations, be it introduction of genetics, like we're just rolling out through beef and lamb genetics in the sheep industry. If we can crack the code on vaccines and inhibitors like we're working on with PGGRC, then we can incorporate that, and then appropriate reckoner sequestrations. So look, that's been a great outcome, and I think a template globally. So look, I'll just finish up there. Look, this is a global sustainability debate. We've all got some big challenges that we all have to get our heads around here. I would just encourage that we do that with the most up-to-date science, and you work collectively with governments that we can work out how we actually drive the behaviours we need, as opposed to getting inappropriate policy settings.
Oh, it was fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for your time. I know you're a busy man, so thank you, and thank you for the patience, for the just changing a little bit the timing of your presentation. It's been your synthesis has been fantastic. So thank you very much again.